Hi. It's hard to believe the semester is almost over, rapidly drawing to a close. So today, what I want to do is take you through the process of analyzing errors on an assessment tool, errors that the student makes, so that you could begin to determine what kinds of interventions would be appropriate for a student. So I'll be presenting to you this guide to reviewing both formal and informal assessment tools to help us determine the types of errors that are being made. So why analyze errors? First of all, it's not enough to know that a student got an answer wrong on a test. Most of the time, a test score is simply going to tell us how many questions a student got right. But that isn't enough information for us to begin to plan what to do with a student. The important questions are, how did they get those items wrong? And what does it mean that they got them wrong? So we're going to talk about how we record student answers on the test protocol, not just a plus or a minus. So you've already given your formal test at this point, and probably you noted that the test is only requiring you to make a notation when the student gets something wrong, and ultimately what you do is add up the number of items the student got correct, and that yields you your various scores. But I reminded you before, a long time ago, that I wanted you to do more than just record the plus or minus, did they get it right or wrong? But I also wanted you to write their answers down on the test protocol. Their answers if they got it right, and their answers if they got it wrong. Now that may seem a little bit redundant, particularly if you're writing down what they got right. But my purpose for that is that if you're writing on every question what the student's response is, you're not indicating to them that they got it right or wrong. And in fact, your answer to them when they ask you, well, what are you doing? You can just say, well, I'm recording everything that you're answering. I'm just writing down what your answers are. And that alleviates a little bit of their anxiety about it. So once again, on the test protocols, when you give the test to the student, if you're asking them questions and you have a sheet, that is the protocol on which you're recording their answers. You're not going to just put a plus if it's correct or a minus if it's wrong. You are going to record exactly what the student answered, so you can go back and analyze it later. Secondly, what you're going to do, and this is after the student has finished the test, and again, it could be a formal assessment or an informal assessment that you've created yourself, much like the ones that we've seen in terms of RTI or curriculum-based measurement. You want to go through the incorrect answers and pull them out and try to group them by the type of error you think a student is making. And then you can review those groupings and develop some hypotheses about the reasons for their errors. In other words, what doesn't the student know how to do? And you would be thinking about, why do you think the student doesn't know how to do that? It may be that they haven't learned a particular skill yet. Or it may be that they're making a simple type of error that you can pick out just by looking at the pattern or the trends in the errors that they're making. We're going to practice this throughout this presentation so you get some ideas about how to do that. And then from there, assuming that you've done a formal test, for example, you would pull from that formal test the errors that the student is making and try to develop some informal assessment tools that would test your hypotheses about the reason for the student errors. And I'll give you a brief example now, but you're going to see a little bit more of that as we go along. So let's say, for example, you gave the student an achievement test that included math computations. And in looking at the test, you noted that the student seemed to be having a problem with addition that included regrouping. Now, on most formal tests, there's likely to be maybe a handful of questions in math computation that require the student to add multi-digit numbers that include regrouping or that require regrouping. So maybe the student got 2 or 3 out of 5 of those types of questions wrong. Well, the simple hypothesis is that the student might not know how to do regrouping, but a further analysis might lead you to some other hypotheses as well. We don't have enough information yet, though, to know if that is really the student's problem. So your task would be to develop an informal assessment tool that would enable you to really zoom in on this issue of addition with regrouping to see if that was a consistent problem that the student had, and to give you a little bit more information that would perhaps enable you to determine why it was that the student is making that type of error. So if you remember back to curriculum-based measures, we talked about creating a probe that might include, I think for curriculum-based measures, we were doing 25 items on a page. Well, your probe might be a probe that would include 25 multiple digit addition problems with and without regrouping. And then you would get a chance to see really if the student consistently was making an error in the regrouping, where your formal test only gave you a little bit of information about that. So that's really the type of thing, or the steps that we want to talk about when we talk about analyzing errors. Moving from a larger, perhaps a formal assessment, separating out what kinds of errors the student made, and then developing some probes to determine whether that really is a problem that the student is experiencing and why that problem occurs. So the first thing we're going to start with is reading errors. We're going to talk about what types of reading errors a student can make, and I'll give you some examples of probes that you can put together that would help you analyze student reading errors in greater detail. So let's first think about what are literacy skills. Now, literacy skills include things like letter naming, and we think about the fluency, how rapidly can the student do that, and what type of errors does the student make. Now that's simply pointing to a letter and saying that's a letter A, for example. Then we look at phoneme segmentation, which is really breaking a word apart into its phonemic parts, and basically reading words and looking at how quickly the student is able to do that, and again the type of errors that a student makes. Now we can combine that with looking at nonsense words. So one type of probe, for example, might be looking at phoneme segmentation using real words that are appropriate for a student at a given reading level, and it also might include nonsense words that tap the same types of skills or the same types of phonemic demands, but are not real words. And again, we look at fluency, segmentation, and then the type of error. Then we look at oral reading as well, and oral reading is reading a passage at an appropriate reading level for the student. And then again, looking at the fluency and the type of errors that a student makes. Retell, which is the beginning of our measures of comprehension. And then finally, comprehension. So let's move on. I'll give you some examples of each of those types of probes, and we'll talk about how to analyze them. When we talk about analysis, first we want to look at the whole picture. So looking at, for example, a reading passage, in general, was this a reading passage that was at an appropriate level for the student? And that we can look at the number of errors that the student got wrong without even considering the type of error. And if you've been taking the reading class, you know a little bit about how to do that. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but determining whether it's an appropriate level instructionally or free reading for the student. And then we look at fluency and the type of error that a student made. So fluency, we're measuring the student's ability to read a passage within a certain time period. And then within that time period, we look at how many errors and what type of errors that a student made and review the whole thing. And then picking that out, again, we want to group the errors according to the type of errors that the student might be making, and then note areas of concern or question. Look for patterns of errors. So does a student consistently have trouble with long vowel sounds, for example? And then develop hypotheses about why that might be. So let's go step by step now through a couple of examples of different types of reading measures and the questions that we're going to be asking about those different types of errors. So when you look at errors, you want to first ask, looking at the whole picture, do the errors seem to indicate a background or vocabulary concern? So is the student stumbling over words that might be more difficult, for example, or is the student having a difficult time with concepts that they may not be familiar with? So again, for example, reading a story about going skiing and building a snowman and making snow angels might be something challenging for a student from Southern California who may never have seen the snow. So they may stumble over some of the things that are happening because they don't have a context to allow them to work through more difficult kinds of words or vocabulary. And then again, how accurate is the student? So how many errors and what type of errors? How fluent is the student, which is how many words they read accurately in a certain amount of time. And then are error patterns consistent with learning a second language? So, for example, some students will seem to be mispronouncing words when in fact they are pronouncing the word correctly for their first language. And you're going to see an example of that in a bit. And then, do you see these errors in the classroom? That's an important question when you're looking at the errors. Is this consistent with what you know about the student? And then finally, was it just a bad day? And by this time, we all know that students can have a bad day when it comes to taking a test. So that can be the reason that a student might make a number of errors on a reading measure. So here's an example now of a letter naming fluency probe. And as you can see, this is a probe that just includes a number of letters that a student is asked to read, and the letters appear in various formats. So they're capital letters, uppercase and lowercase letters. And the student had a sample that looked like this, and the teacher had a sample that was her protocol on which she could mark the student errors as he or she read the letters in sequence. So you can take a look at, in this particular case, what letters did the student miss? And this teacher who gave the student a probe like this did a good job, because if you note, she put what the student did wrong, what the student said instead of the correct letter, so that you have an opportunity to think about what kind of error is the student making. So the first thing I want you to do is take a look at these errors. And you have the probe. For example, the first error, the probe was G. And you have what the student said instead, which the student said A. So the probe, the student's response, what kind of an error do you think that is? And then move to the next one. In that case, it's a Y, lowercase y. There's nothing written above it, so we can assume that the student simply didn't know the answer to that, didn't provide a response to that. The next one, it was a Z, and rather than Z, the student said V. And you go along and you can see some of the other errors that the student made. So we want to make a listing of all the types of errors. And where you see the red bracket at the end, it represents where the student needed to stop in terms of the amount of time that was given them to read this. So we're looking at out of the letters that the student could read in the time allowed, how many errors did the student get? How many errors did the student get? How many correct? How many incorrect? So, did you make your list of the letters that the student missed and how they missed it? Can you figure out why? Are there some examples in there that are examples of having a difficult time with the shape of the letter? Did you see some reversals? Did you see the student having difficulty with capital versus lowercase, and so forth? What kind of errors did you see the student making in this very simple probe? I see a few errors in terms of shape. one aspect of reading and literacy is being able to recognize letters in a variety of different configurations, different ways of writing them. And you see the G there, which is a difficult G for some students because it's not common. It's not what you would print yourself. And the student's response to that was A, which might have been a good guess. I also see a consistent problem if I'm looking for a pattern of errors, that the student seems to be having trouble with the letter Z, consistently missed it throughout, tried to come up with a response a couple of times, but he gave up towards the end, didn't even bother. And I also see some reversals there. Maybe you see some other things, but that's how we start to analyze indeed whether the student is having a particular problem or not. So now think about this. If the problem is shape, so back, for example, to that G, if you think it was because the G was presented to the student in an unfamiliar form, and that is what gave the student difficulty, could you create a simple probe that would enable you to determine if the shape of the letter was a problem for the student? It might be a simple worksheet, just like the one that we saw previous above, and it might have maybe 10 letters on a page that were presented in various kinds of shapes. Because when you read a book, you will see different types of fonts, right? So can the student recognize the letter when it's presented in a different font format? I had one student once that said, well, it's not supposed to look like that. They knew what the letter was, but they also knew it wasn't presented to them in a shape that wasn't familiar to them. So, and we'll move on to phoneme segmentation. Does the student know how to segment phonemes? So break a word apart into its separate phonemic sounds. Does the student segment partially but not the whole? How accurate is the student? So what type of error are they making? How fluent is the student? How many words can they read in a given amount of time? And then are we seeing problems with initial sounds, ending sounds, or vowels, for example? Or what other kinds of problems might we be seeing? So here's an example of a simple probe for phoneme segmentation, and this particular probe uses real words, but we could create a probe that was nonsense words as well. Now, the student would see just a page, a paper, worksheet with the words themselves written on it. It might be a word list, it could be flashcards that they're looking at, and the teacher has her own protocol, which looks like this, where the teacher has broken the words down into their various phonemes. So as you can see, the first word rich is broken down into 3 phonemes, with the R sound, the short I sound, and the CH sound representing the 3 phonemes. And if you look at this, there's a strike through on the CH, meaning that the student didn't say that or didn't pronounce it correctly. This teacher did not write how the student got it wrong, so it's a limited probe for us. More rich information would have been to write above the phonemic segment what the student's error was, but all we have here is simply that the student made an error with CH. Look at the next word, hawk. The K is struck through, so the student did not either made an error about the K or didn't say the K. With past, you see it broken down into 4 phonemic segments, and there's a strike through on the last one, which is the T. Roof, there's a strike through on the F, but there's also, if you look, there's an S. So the student said whatever they said, they added an S to the word. So that counts as an error as well. And on the far side, looking at this, the far right side, you can see that there, for the first line, for example, the 2 words rich and hawk represent 6 phoneme segments that a student would be expected to read. And of this, counting it up, the student was able to read the student got 3 out of the 6 phoneme segments correct. So So we can go right down the list and you see the total at the bottom. They got a total of 20 phoneme segments out of a possible 44. And again, that red bracket indicates where the student stopped in the allotted time. So they did not read the last 2 words. That's why those are written as 0 out of 6 possible phonemes. So can you organize those errors? What kinds of patterns do you see there? Do you see a consistent problem of any sort? Let's go back to the kinds of questions to ask. Do you see the student able to segment phonemes? Well, it looks like the student is reading words. Are they segmenting partially but not the whole? Or do you see problems with particular placement of the letter sounds? So if I look at this, I'm seeing that the ending sounds, particularly when they're combination sounds, are what's giving the student more of a problem. So there's a consistent problem with CH, with SH, NG, so these vowel combinations at the end look like they're difficult for the student. And again, consistently looking at this, it's the ending sounds, even if it's not a vowel, even if it's not a consonant combination, that's giving the student a problem here. So I might want to create a probe in which I gave the student a number of words that had vowel combinations for the ending sounds to see if to get at more detail about what the student's problems might be in that particular area of phoneme segmentation. Then we look to oral reading. How accurate is the student? Again, what types of errors is the student making? How fluent is the student? So words per minute. Usually we give them a passage that we expect them to read in 1 minute, and we mark where the student ends. So we have how many words did the student read per minute, and then we look at we subtract the number of errors that a student made to get a measure of fluency. Again, looking for a pattern in word errors. Is it phonetic or not phonetic? Looking at memory for prompted words. So if you give the student a word and that word reappears later on in the story, does the student remember that word based on your prompt? And then problems with multisyllabic words, words missed due to limited vocabulary. Those are the kinds of questions that we tend to ask. So here's an example, again, just striking out the words that the student didn't read correctly, but not writing in what the student did. So we get limited information from this, but we get some information. This is a story about going to family camp, and you can pull out the kinds of words that the student was not able to read correctly. So if you made a list, again, of the probe, for example, camp is the first probe that the student got wrong. The word is camp. We know the student didn't read it correctly, but we don't know how they read it. But we're going to pull out all of the errors: camp, program, wait, where, big, snuggle, and so forth, and then take a look at to try to see what kinds of errors is the student making? Again, answering these types of questions. How accurate is the student? How fluent is the student? I mean, the student read 43 words correctly in the allotted amount of time, that red bracket indicating where the student stopped. So he's 81% accurate. And so that's low level of instructional level. But looking at the words, I can see a lot of words that the student didn't read that are really going to impact their comprehension of that story. So even though they're reading it with a certain level of, an acceptable level maybe of accuracy, it's in terms of reading the words, to me, it's a questionable level of accuracy because I would be worried about comprehension. Limited information, however, here because using this probe, the teacher just crossed out the words the student didn't read correctly, but did not note how the student did it incorrectly. Now here's an example, and you have this on Moodle. You have there are some handouts for you to look at. One of them includes a story of the yucca plant. And in this particular case, the tester did write above the word that the student got wrong, how the student got it wrong. So you can see this gives us much more information if we're thinking about doing an error analysis. So we have lots of different types of errors present here. And what we want to do, and here's my challenge to you, is to create an error analysis worksheet in which you are writing down what the probe is, what was the stimulus for the student, what was their response, and then what type of error do you think it was? And I've given you some examples to get you started. So for example, in this particular probe, we have the yucca plant, which is the title of the story, is circled. The circle means that the student omitted that particular set of words. So if you look back at my beginning to analyze these errors, the probe was the yucca plant. The response was that the student omitted it. And what type of error is it? It's the use of the title as an organizer. So right away, the student is not using the title to tell them what this story is going to be about. And that, I think, becomes a problem as we go along, which I think you'll see. The second error the student made was in talking about the yucca plant. Instead of yucca, they said yucca. So back to my error analysis worksheet, the probe was yucca. The student's response was yucca. And so one type of error that could be is that the student may not know the double consonant rule and how that affects the sound of the vowel that precedes a double consonant. That could be the problem. But remember also that one of the questions that we want to ask is, could this be a result of learning English as a second language? And in fact, yucca is the appropriate pronunciation of yucca in some languages. So we might have two hypotheses about this type of error that we would want to think a little bit about to determine what type of error the student is making. So you have this whole worksheet. I've just given you an example of the first two paragraphs here, which I think is really pretty much all you need. That was way too much for the student to read in an appropriate amount of time. And you can see by the number of errors that there's very little understanding that's going on here. So what I'd like you to do is make yourself an error analysis sheet and look at these first two paragraphs presented here and make a list of each word the student got wrong and how they got it wrong, and come up with some ideas for that third column of what type of error you think it is or what hypothesis you might have about it. And as you're thinking about that, so for example, if you look at yucca versus yucca, and my suggestion was that it's the double consonant rule. How would you check that out? Could you make another kind of probe that would help you determine whether the double consonant rule was a problem for the student or whether indeed it was an issue with a second language learner? So think about a one-page worksheet that you might construct that would help you get at least one of the types of errors that the student is making to get more details about whether that was a consistent problem or not. So take a few minutes to work through that worksheet and create this error analysis worksheet and perhaps a probe that would go along with it. And then we'll move on from there. So moving on from there, the next two components that we are concerned with in reading is retell and comprehension. So the questions there are, can the student retell key components of the story? And usually we expect the student to be able to retell those key components in a sequence, in an appropriate sequence, so a beginning, middle pieces, and an end. And we expect them to pick out or remember key words or key details of the story. And can the student use closure skills to fill in the blanks? Now that's the very simplest way that we have of measuring comprehension. And those of you who did the Woodcock-Johnson, for example, you know that they use closure as a primary way of measuring comprehension. You have to fill in the blank with a word that fits. So you have to understand the whole sentence, and then you have to have the vocabulary to enable you to identify a word that will fit appropriately in the blank. Can the student identify the main idea? Can the student recall facts from the story? Can the student draw inferences? And can the student make predictions? So that's what we look at when we look at retell and comprehension. So here's another challenge for you. Can you create a reading comprehension protocol for the yucca plant story that would include a question or a probe for each type of comprehension item that is listed in the previous slide? And I'd refer you back to the material on curriculum-based measurement that we went through a couple of weeks ago. And if you remember, Miss Bartlett, I think, created a comprehension probe for her student. And that gives you some nice examples of different questions that you might ask in terms of recall, factual comprehension, inferential comprehension, and so forth. So here's your challenge. Create a reading comprehension protocol that would include all of the different types of comprehension questions for that yucca plant story. I'll give you some time to do that, and then you can come back to this PowerPoint presentation. So now we're going to move on to analyzing math errors. So we're simply going to look at basic math skills. There certainly are lots more than this, but for this presentation, I'm just going to zero in on a few. Addition and subtraction being one, multiplication and division being another, fractions, and then word problems. And again, think back to our curriculum-based measures and also the RTI information. And you'll have some examples of different types of probes that could be used to look at these various math skills. So let's start with addition and subtraction. What kinds of problems can you make in this area? Well, one type certainly is a lack of understanding of regrouping, and students do have a difficult time with that sometimes. They can confuse the ones and the tens in carrying and writing. They can forget to carry the tens and the hundreds. They can forget to regroup when subtracting. They can regroup when they're not required to do so. And they can do incorrect operations, so not noticing the plus or the minus sign, for example. So they might add when they should subtract or subtract when they should add. And this type of problem typically occurs when there are multiple types of operations on a single page, where they're having to really attend to the sign, and because there are multiple signs. So here's an example of a math error analysis worksheet, and you have this on Moodle so you can see it a little better probably than what you see on the slide. And on this worksheet there are 20 addition problems, and they represent 5 different types of errors a student could make. So there are 4 examples of each type of error. Here's your challenge. Can you group these problems into 5 groups based on the error type? So I'll get you started. Number 1 is a simple error in addition. So it was 22 plus 31. The student added 1 and 2, got 1 plus 2 correctly and got 3, added 3 plus 2 and got 4. The only kind of error that is just a simple error in addition. And that might be easily solved. And there are 3 other examples of that type of error where it's simply a mistake in adding. So now for a bonus point, please go through this worksheet and come up with the 5 different groups and the 4 examples of 5 different error types and the 4 examples of each error type labeled by the type of error. So if you can do that, upload that onto Moodle, and that's worth a bonus point this week. By the way, there's another worksheet also on Moodle that gives you some examples of other types of errors that are in things like multiplication, fraction, addition, and so forth. So just different types of problems that a student might make errors in, and the challenge is to figure out what the errors are for each of those types of problems too. So just another worksheet to get you thinking about how to do error analysis. So when we have multiplication and division, students can make errors in multiplication and division by forgetting to carry in multiplication, carrying before multiplying, ignoring place value in division, recording the answer from left to right in multiplication, lack of alignment of work in columns. That's a real problem for a lot of our kids with learning disabilities, being able to line things up correctly. And then knowledge of basic number facts. So if you think about this, how would you determine that a student was having a problem with carrying in multiplication? What kind of a probe would you come up with that would have problems on a page that would require a student to do that? That would probably help you hit at a variety of these types of problems. But can you imagine making a worksheet with maybe 25 problems on it in multiplication and division that would help you determine if a student was experiencing any of these types of problems in the area of multiplication and division? Fractions is next. So we have incorrect cancellation of the fraction, failure to reduce to the lowest common denominator, ignoring the remainder, and incorrect conversion of mixed numbers to fractions. So again, a one-page probe that would get at some of the common problems with fractions might be something that you would create in order to determine if a student had one of these types of problems. And here's how we would do it. Let's say you gave the student the Woodcock-Johnson, and on that there are several problems that involve fractions, and perhaps the student got stuck when it came to those problems. Perhaps they did the simple ones, like adding fractions with like denominators, but had a problem beyond that. So you would want to create a probe that would have a number of fractions on a page at different levels of difficulty. It might represent a curriculum for a year on fractions, and that way you can get at more than the number of fraction problems that are offered on the Woodcock-Johnson to really get down to what are the problems a student is experiencing. And finally, we're going to think about word problems. And word problems can have a number of issues associated with them, the first of which would be difficulty in reading. So how would you determine if a student was having a problem with simply reading the word problem? I think definitely one of the things that I would want to do with a student is to give them word problems that were written at their reading level, and have them read the word problem orally to me. And I could use that in the same kind of way I might use a reading passage probe and record errors in the same kind of way I would record errors if I was looking at the student's ability to read that passage. So that is going to give me a lot of information about why the student is having trouble with word problems. If they can't read certain words, they're not going to be able to figure out what to do with the problem itself. Students can also have problems with relating to the context of the problem. So if you were asking students who grew up here in Los Angeles to relate to a farmer who is calculating how many quarts of milk his herd of cows can give when each cow gives approximately 4 quarts of milk at each milking, students here might struggle a little bit just with the concept of being on the farm and what is a quart of milk, what does that look like with the cow giving the milk and that kind of thing. It wouldn't be a problem that they encounter in everyday life, so they might have difficulty relating to the context. Inability to understand the language and vocabulary of the problem. Well, that sort of interacts with the first one, difficulty in reading. So if you're stumbling over certain words, that's certainly going to affect whether you can do the word problem or not. But some words in a problem are more important than others. So when I think about the vocabulary of a word problem, I think about the important math vocabulary that a student needs to understand and the variations in math vocabulary that are keys to understanding what you need to do to solve the problem. So how many words, for example, are there that tell you to add numbers together? Think about that. Student needs to know each one of those kinds of words to understand the task. And how would you get at whether or not they understood math vocabulary? I think of things like that's something what that flashcards or word lists would be really helpful before we even get to word problems. A pre-test for a student might be, can they decode and do they understand? Can they define the various words that are used in word problems to indicate what is needed or what the student needs to do? And then difficulty in identifying the relevant and the irrelevant parts of the story or of the word problem. Lots of word problems throw things into it that aren't important at all. And a student needs to be able to put that stuff aside, and sometimes they get bogged down in the irrelevant information and try to do something with it when it's not important. So think of some examples where you've encountered word problems that have irrelevant information in them, but you thought maybe that information was important. Then difficulty in identifying the number of steps in a problem. So when we have word problems that have multiple steps related to them, that can be a problem for a student. They might see the first part of the problem and be able to do that, but not know that there's more steps that need to be done. And then finally, they can have trouble in simply doing the mathematical operations themselves. And that is, they understood the problem, they knew it was an addition problem, they set up the addition problem correctly as a computational problem, but they got it wrong. So that can happen too. So we look at students' responses to word problems and think about these as being potential reasons for the difficulty that a student might have. So this is a short lecture this week because I know you have a lot to do in trying to get the critique done. And that is your primary assignment for this week. But let's just conclude this discussion of error analysis because it is very important. So once again, knowing how a student got a test item wrong is more important than a test score itself. And we've spent a lot of time worrying about test scores and figuring out what they mean and giving a test to a student and finding out what table to look at or how to plug that into the computer to get our standard scores. We spent so much time with that, and yet that's the least important part of giving tests, particularly standardized tests to students. The score only tells us how many right answers a student got. And that's not very much information to go by. So if you know the student had a standard score of 85 on a Q-type test in math, for example, you know that they're one standard deviation below the mean, but that doesn't tell you what to do with them on Monday morning. And as a teacher, that's what I want to know. I want to know, what do I need to work on next with this student to help them understand more about math, to help them get a higher score the next time, to teach them what they need to know. So the first swipe is to do a simple analysis that tells us what type of problems were incorrect. So if I do nothing else but look back at the test at the end of the day and say, well, the student got problems that involved regrouping incorrect, that's a good beginning because at least then I know that regrouping may be a problem that the student has. But I still, even with that, I know more, but I don't know enough. What I need is a detailed analysis to tell me what type of errors the student is making. So if they're getting problems that involve addition with regrouping incorrect, how are they getting those problems incorrect? And this presentation was designed to give you some ideas to get you started in thinking about why a student might be making the errors that they're making. And then that leads you to what you might need to do about that, what you might need to do to help the student. You need to complete a full error analysis for at least one academic area that you've assessed. So all of you have done now assessments, formal tests that have looked at 3 major areas of academic performance: reading or language arts, math, and written language arts. writing, which may include spelling and other writing of sentences and passages and so forth. So you have three major areas that you've looked at, and the requirement for the class is to complete an error analysis for at least one of those academic areas. So I want you to zero in on what you think the student is having the most difficulty with. So perhaps you think they're doing all right in math, but they seem to have some significant problems in reading. That's where the score comes in handy, because you can see how far apart the student is in the three academic areas. So perhaps they're scoring, and they have an average score in math, and they have a below average score in reading and so forth. So first swipe, you know that. So you might determine if their score is lowest in the area of reading, you might determine that that is the academic area that you want to do a more complete analysis of. So the first thing you're going to do is look at that area and separate out the questions that the student got wrong. So you're going to make a list of the errors that the student made. So if we're talking about reading and they had a word list, you're going to pull out the words that they got wrong and make a list of those words. And if you've done your testing correctly, you've also included not just an X through it that the student got it wrong, but you've also written what the student said as their answer instead of the correct answer. So either they didn't know and they skipped it, that's good information, or they misread it. They didn't see the silent E, for example, at the end of the word made, and they read it as mad. So I want you to put next to the word that the student got wrong, how they got it wrong. And then again, think about what are the reasons, what type of error is the student making? And look through that for consistencies, for patterns of errors. Now, I would like you to do that and include your error analysis for at least one academic area in your formal assessment report. So where you're reporting results, you need to be reporting, of course, scores, because that's what we've been practicing a lot. But I also want you to include, in addition to the scores, an error analysis of that one academic area. So even though you've tested 3, you only need to do an analysis of 1. And from that analysis, I want you to create a simple probe. And we've talked a little bit today about what kinds of probes there might be. You also had some examples with curriculum-based measurement. You had some examples with RTI. I want you to create a simple probe to determine more about your student's ability in one part of that one academic area. So, for example, if you were looking at the student's errors in reading and you saw that they seem to be consistently not using the silent E rule, and so their long vowels were not being read appropriately, then you might create a probe, a one-page probe, that might have on it 10 to 20 words that would include both short vowel and long vowel examples like mad and made, and give that student a list of the words, maybe they're flashcards or something like that, where you have a protocol that you have for yourself where you can record the errors that the student makes on your simple informal test that you've created. We're going to be talking a little bit more as we go along in the next few weeks about other types of informal probes you could create. But the idea behind this is to say, I think the student has a problem in this area. The formal test I gave identified that the student got these types of things wrong, but I need a more in-depth look at these types of things to see if that is indeed a problem the student has, and also to try to get at the nature of the problem related to that area. So that's where the different parts of your final project come into play. You have your formal assessment report that is based on the standardized test that you gave. Part of that report is going to include a full error analysis for at least one academic area. And I would like to see the error analysis worksheets that you put together where you've listed errors and you've listed what kind of error you think it is. So I want you to include that with your formal report as well. And then based on that, you're going to select an area that you're going to do an informal assessment of to get more information about your student's ability. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about that final big assignment, which is due in just a few weeks. I think it's due on Thanksgiving week, the formal part anyway, so I can give you some feedback on that before you have to go and put the whole thing together for your final report. That does it for this week.